When I gave my son $670,000, I thought I was saving his business. But later, I found out that he used my retirement money to buy his mistress a big beach house. I was in my late 60s when all of this started. I had been living a quiet and steady life after my wife passed. I kept to simple routines, and I tried to protect the savings I worked for since I was a young man. I was careful with every dollar because I wanted to make sure I would not become a burden to anyone, especially my son. I had planned for a modest retirement, nothing fancy, but I felt proud that I had held things together all those years. My son, Mark Ellison, was in his mid-40s. He owned a small construction company. It was the kind of business that had ups and downs. Some years he did well, and some years he struggled. I always hoped he would reach a point of stability, but that never fully happened. Still, I believed in him. I trusted him. I wanted to see him succeed because I felt that would honor the work his mother and I had put into raising him. One evening he came to my house without warning. I noticed right away that his hands were shaking a little. He sat down at my kitchen table and kept pressing his fingers against his forehead like he was trying to keep himself steady. He told me the business was falling apart. He said he was behind on paying suppliers and he worried that some of his workers might walk away. He used phrases like critical point and immediate risk and kept saying he had no time left. He looked worn down and I could see fear in his eyes. He followed up with an email later that night. He attached a short cash flow document, and in the message he said the company would collapse within weeks without a large amount of help. I read the document several times. It showed numbers, debts, upcoming expenses, and what looked like overdue bills. It worried me deeply. I knew he would not send something like that unless he was desperate. I did not question anything. I felt protective and scared for him. I remember sitting in my living room with the lights off, reading the email again on my phone. I started thinking through my finances. I had a retirement account that was not huge but stable. I had a set of certificates I bought over many years. I had a few other savings that I had planned to use slowly as I aged. I knew pulling money out early would bring penalties and taxes, but I kept thinking about Mark saying he had only a few weeks left. The next morning I went to the bank. I sat with the advisor for nearly an hour, going through the process of withdrawing large amounts from my retirement account. I paid penalties I did not want to pay, but I convinced myself that saving my son's business was worth it. After that, I cashed out certificates I held onto since my wife was still alive. It hurt to let them go, but I kept thinking about how proud she was of Mark and how she would have wanted me to help him. In the end, I gathered $670,000. I wired the money to Mark's business account the same day. When the confirmation email arrived, I felt a strange mix of relief and fear. I hoped I had saved my son from losing everything. That night I slept poorly, but I told myself that I had done the right thing. I believed I had helped my son secure his future, and I hoped he would never have to reach out to me in that kind of desperation again. The first few weeks after the transfer, I expected to hear regular updates from Mark. I thought he would tell me how the business was stabilizing or how workers were staying on because of the money. Instead, things grew quiet. He sent short messages now and then, but they were vague. He kept saying he was exhausted and had too much going on. When I tried to ask how things were improving, he brushed it off with general remarks about progress and heavy workloads. None of it sounded solid. I tried not to think too much of it at first. I knew he was under stress. Still, something felt off. He had always been the kind of person who talked a lot when he achieved something, yet now, after receiving the largest financial help I had ever given anyone, he barely said a word. I felt nervous about it. I kept telling myself to be patient, but each week that passed made my concern grow. About a month after the transfer, a small moment shifted things for me. I stopped by a hardware store where a contractor I knew from years ago still worked part-time. We talked casually about local construction jobs the way older men do when they cross paths. When I mentioned Mark's company, the contractor said he hadn't seen Mark's crew active on bigger sites lately. He said he thought they were doing less work these days, not more. He said it with a neutral tone, like it was just an observation, but hearing that felt like a cold weight dropping inside me. Mark had told me he was overwhelmed with projects, yet the people in the industry were saying the opposite. A week later, I received a call from a distant relative. During small talk, they mentioned seeing something on social media about Mark getting away to the coast. They joked about how he must be treating himself to short breaks. I stayed quiet because I didn't know how to respond. Mark had told me the business needed constant attention, and he had been insisting he had no time to rest. Hearing he was spending time at the coast made me feel uneasy. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the feeling stayed with me the rest of the day. As the weeks went by, Mark started visiting me less. He used to stop by once a week, but now he only came around every few weeks. When he did visit, he seemed distracted and rushed. I tried to ask normal questions. I asked how he was holding up, whether his workers were staying, whether the money helped. He answered each question in short, clipped lines, giving no real detail. He said he was too tired to talk, or that he had to leave early to handle something urgent. He kept glancing at his phone during those visits. I felt shut out, and that hurt. I started revisiting the emails and texts he sent me when he asked for the money. I read the cash flow document again. The numbers looked stressful, but not as sudden or severe as he had described. The dates bothered me. The supposed overdue invoices didn't match the timeline he gave in person. He had told me he had only weeks left before the business collapsed, but the document listed expenses and obligations spread out over a longer period. It looked like a struggling business, yes, but not one on the edge of shutting down within days. That realization made me feel a deep sadness. It was the first moment I wondered if he had exaggerated to get the money. I also noticed he had stopped updating me entirely about how the funds were being used. I wasn't demanding, but I expected some explanation. I expected him to tell me which debts he cleared or which workers he paid. Instead, there was nothing. When I asked, he seemed irritated. He would say he was too stressed to break down numbers or that I needed to trust him. The tone he used was sharp and dismissive, unlike anything he had ever used with me before. By the end of the second month, I found myself sitting alone at my kitchen table, staring at my phone after another vague message from him. I realized I no longer understood what was happening in his life or his business. And for the first time, I felt more than worry. I felt that something was wrong, something he didn't want me to see. That feeling stayed with me and grew heavier each day, pushing me toward the truth I didn't want to uncover. The first time I heard about the coastal town, it was almost by accident. I was standing outside talking with my neighbor, a man who liked to keep track of traffic on our street. He mentioned that he thought he had seen Mark's truck down near a coastal area about 2 hours from us. He said he had relatives in that town and visited often, and he was sure he had noticed the same truck parked near the nicer homes more than once. He said it casually without knowing anything about my growing concern, but the comment struck me hard. I tried to stay calm, but inside I felt a sharp rise of worry. I thanked him and pretended it meant nothing, but the moment I walked back inside my house, I couldn't stop thinking about it. For a few days, I did nothing. I tried to convince myself the neighbor was mistaken. A lot of trucks looked similar. Maybe Mark had a legitimate job in that area. Maybe it was normal. I went through every reasonable explanation I could think of, but none of them settled the feeling in my chest. The business wasn't active the way Mark claimed. He wasn't communicating with me. The contractor I knew hadn't seen his crew working, and now this new detail about the coast was added to everything else. One afternoon, after hours of going back and forth in my mind, I decided to drive out there. I told myself it was just to ease my worry. The drive was long and quiet. I kept thinking about my wife and how she always told me to trust my instincts. When I reached the town, I drove slowly through the residential areas, especially near the nicer homes where my neighbor said he had seen the truck. I looked at driveways and side streets, trying not to appear suspicious. But after more than an hour of circling, I saw nothing. No sign of Mark, no sign of his truck. I drove home feeling tired and foolish, telling myself I had let my imagination get carried away. But the feeling didn't fade. Over the next week, it only grew stronger. Each time Mark sent a short message saying he was busy at work, I felt more certain he wasn't being honest. I kept hearing my neighbor's words in my head. So the next weekend, I drove out there again. This time, I parked and walked through some of the quieter streets. I looked at houses that had recently been renovated, the kind of places someone might buy if they wanted a private escape. Still nothing. I went home again, frustrated and unsettled. It became a pattern. Every few days, when Mark claimed he was working late or dealing with a crisis, I made another drive to the coastal town. I tried to go at different hours, hoping the change in timing might show me something new. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding paranoid. I just wanted to either find proof that everything was fine or discover the truth I felt I was being kept from. On one of those trips, after almost a month of searching, something changed. I was turning down a street near a row of newly renovated homes when I saw a familiar truck parked in a driveway. It was Mark's truck. I recognized the dent on the side, the license plate numbers, and the worn stickers on the back window. My heart felt heavy when I realized I finally found what I hoped didn't exist. I parked a short distance away and watched from inside my car. I didn't know what I expected to see. I sat there for a long time trying to gather my thoughts. Then I saw the front door of the house open. Mark stepped out, looking relaxed. A few moments later, a younger woman came outside. She walked toward him with an ease that showed this wasn't their first time together. She leaned into him warmly, and he responded in a way that made it clear they were more than friends. I sat still, watching the scene unfold, feeling disbelief and sadness. I didn't feel anger yet. That would come later. At that moment, I felt a deep kind of hurt I didn't know how to process. I realized the trips Mark had been taking were not work-related. I realized he had been using the money I gave him for something far from survival or business recovery. I didn't confront them. I didn't approach the house. I drove away slowly, needing time to think. When I got home, I checked the county property website. It took a few days before the deed showed up online, but when it did, I saw Mark's name listed as the new owner of that beach house. The sale price was almost the exact amount I had sent him. That confirmation hit me harder than anything else. It was no longer suspicion. It was the truth, laid out in public records. I sat in my living room for a long time after that, staring at the printed deed. I felt betrayed by my own son in a way I never expected to experience, and I knew this was only the beginning of what I would have to face. I sat at home for hours after I saw the deed posted online. I kept the page open on my computer screen, staring at Mark's name beside the beach house address. Seeing it there in a public record made everything real in a way I hadn't been ready for. I felt a heavy sadness, something deep and painful. I wanted to believe there was a misunderstanding, but the numbers told the truth. The place cost nearly the same amount I had given him. It was impossible to ignore what that meant. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. I didn't call Mark. I didn't confront him. I needed time. I needed to understand everything before saying a single word. So I started going through the documents he sent me months earlier. I opened the cash flow sheet he had emailed. I remembered how frightened he looked when he told me the business was collapsing, but now, reading it again, I saw it clearly. The document showed a stressed business, yes, but not one that was about to close in a matter of weeks. The debts he listed were spread out. The overdue items weren't as urgent as he made them sound. He had twisted the truth to get me to act fast. I printed the document and set it on my kitchen table. Then I printed the email that came with it. His message said he needed immediate help to cover workers' pay and supplier fees. He made it sound like he had no other option. But standing in my kitchen with those papers laid out, knowing he bought a beach house instead, made me feel sick. I felt betrayed by someone I loved more than anyone else in my life. Next, I printed the bank transfer record from my account. It showed the exact amount leaving my retirement savings and going straight into his business account. I remembered sitting in the bank, feeling worried but hopeful, believing I was saving him. Now that memory felt painful. I gathered every message where he thanked me and repeated that he would make things right soon and fix everything. Looking back at his words, I felt a deep sadness because they were written with confidence, as if he knew I would never doubt him. I decided to organize everything into a folder. The cash flow document, the emails, the texts, the transfer record, and a printout of the property listing showing Mark as the owner. I didn't know yet what I would do with it, but collecting it helped me stay steady. It made me feel like I had something solid to rely on during a moment when my trust in him was gone. But I still needed clarity about how long this had been happening, so I drove back to the beach town one afternoon. I parked where I could see the house without being noticed. After a while, I saw the same woman step outside again. She carried bags from a store, moving comfortably like someone who had been living there for a while. Mark arrived later, wearing casual clothes I hadn't seen him wear in months. They looked familiar with each other, doing small things around the house together. I watched long enough to understand this wasn't new. This wasn't something that had just started. This affair had been going on for some time. Driving home, I kept thinking about all the days he told me he was working late or too overwhelmed to talk. I thought about the times I waited for updates about the business, feeling worried and hoping he was getting things back on track. Instead, he had been here, spending time at a house I unknowingly financed, while his wife stayed home believing he was fighting to keep his company alive. When I arrived home, I sat down at my dining table with the folder in front of me. I added notes to help keep things straight. I wrote down dates of our conversations, dates of the transfers, dates of my drives to the coast, and dates when I saw evidence of the affair. As the list grew, everything became clearer. This wasn't a moment of bad judgment on his part. This was a pattern, a choice he had been making over and over. I remember feeling a deep kind of exhaustion as I looked at the papers. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I wasn't thinking about anger. I just felt hurt. I felt like something in my life had shifted in a way I didn't know how to repair. But I also realized that I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't let the truth sit in silence. I needed to confront him, not out of anger, but because I deserved to hear him say the truth. I didn't know how he would react or what he would say, but I knew that the next step had to be a conversation, and it had to happen soon. I decided to confront Mark the following week. I didn't want to do it over the phone or through messages. I needed to look at him and give him a chance to explain himself. I asked him to come over one afternoon. I told him I wanted to talk about the business and check in on how he was doing. He agreed, but he sounded distracted. When he arrived, he walked into the house with the same rushed energy he'd had for months. He barely took his jacket off before asking what I wanted to discuss. I didn't try to ease into it. I placed the folder on the table and opened it. I laid out the bank transfer record, the emails he had sent me, the cash flow document, and the printed deed to the beach house. I watched his expression shift. At first he looked confused, then he recognized the papers and his face tightened. He said nothing, so I explained everything I had seen and done. I told him about the trips I made to the coastal town. I told him about seeing him with a woman. I told him I checked the property records. My voice stayed steady, but inside I felt shaky and sad. Mark finally spoke. His tone was tense and defensive. He said the business was barely hanging on and that he was under too much pressure to give daily updates. He said the cash flow document was real and that I didn't understand how fast things could crumble in construction. I told him calmly that I did understand numbers and that the document showed a struggling company, but not one in a sudden collapse. He avoided looking at the deed and wouldn't acknowledge what was listed there. When I mentioned the beach house directly, he reacted sharply. He said he needed a place away from everything because he felt trapped. He said life at home had become difficult and he needed space to think. He said the woman meant something to him and he felt he deserved a chance at happiness. Listening to him say that made me feel worse than anything else he said. I had given him my retirement savings with the belief that he was fighting to keep his business alive. Instead, he was talking about personal escape and new relationships. I told him I felt deeply betrayed. I told him he had used my trust and my money in a way that hurt me. He became angry. He said I always doubted him, that I made him feel small, and that he didn't owe me every detail of his life. He said he would pay me back when he could, but he acted as if I was overreacting. The dismissive tone cut into me. I had sacrificed almost everything I'd worked for, and he acted like it was an inconvenience to explain himself. I told him clearly in a steady voice that he obtained the money by telling me it was for business emergencies. I said that was a serious issue, not a misunderstanding. He looked at me with frustration and disbelief, as if he couldn't accept that I was challenging him. When he left the house that day, he slammed the door behind him. I sat in my chair for a long time afterward, feeling drained and heartbroken. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Mark's wife contacted me. She said she was confused and asked if I knew anything about a legal letter that had arrived at their home, addressed to Mark regarding a property in the coastal area. She sounded nervous and upset. I didn't want to cause her pain, but I also couldn't lie. I told her I knew about the house and that I believed she should ask Mark directly. She called me again later that night, crying. She told me she had confronted him, and he had admitted to the affair and the house after trying to avoid the subject. She said she felt humiliated and lost. Hearing her cry made me feel even worse. Mark's choices were hurting everyone around him. After that conversation, I knew I couldn't leave things as they were. I needed to protect what little remained of my future. I contacted an attorney and scheduled a meeting. When I sat down in the office, I felt embarrassed that I had let myself be taken advantage of, even by my own son. The attorney listened carefully as I explained everything. Then I handed him the folder. He went through each document slowly. He looked at the transfer, the emails where Mark said the money would cover workers and suppliers, the cash flow sheet, and the deed to the beach house. He told me that my case was strong. He said this fell under fraudulent inducement because Mark created a false sense of urgency to get me to transfer the money. He also mentioned unjust enrichment, because Mark benefited from the money in a way that went against the purpose he stated. He explained that a civil claim was the appropriate route, and he believed a judge would see the deception clearly based on the documents. Hearing that made me feel both sad and relieved. I didn't want to sue my son, but I felt I had no choice. The attorney prepared the filing. It took time, and every step felt heavy. I felt a mixture of grief and determination. I knew Mark would be angry, but I couldn't let his decisions destroy my remaining years. When the documents were finally filed and sent to Mark, he responded with more anger. He sent me messages saying I had ruined his life and that I didn't understand his situation. I didn't answer. I had already said everything that needed to be said. The legal process had begun, and there was no turning back. The legal process moved slowly, and each step weighed on me. I had never set foot in a courtroom before this. I never imagined I would be there because of something connected to my own child. When the hearing dates were scheduled, I marked them on a small calendar next to my recliner. Each time I looked at those dates, I felt a quiet sadness. I kept telling myself I wasn't doing this to punish Mark. I was doing it because I had no other way to protect myself after losing almost everything I had saved. The first hearing felt strange. I sat on one side of the room with my attorney. Mark sat on the other side with his attorney. He didn't look at me at first. He stared at the table in front of him. When he finally glanced my way, the expression on his face wasn't regret or apology. It was anger. He looked at me like I had betrayed him, even though he was the one who had misled me. That look stayed with me long after the hearing ended. The judge asked questions about the transfer, the purpose of the money, and the documents Mark had sent me. My attorney explained each piece calmly. He showed the bank transfer record. He showed the email where Mark wrote that he needed urgent help to pay overdue workers and suppliers. He showed the cash flow attachment with the dates and numbers that didn't match Mark's dramatic claims. He explained the timeline of the beach house purchase and presented the deed that showed Mark had bought the property shortly after receiving the funds. Mark's attorney tried to argue that the business truly was struggling and that Mark believed the money would help him restructure his life and start fresh. He tried to frame it as a misunderstanding of intent. But the judge kept returning to the same point. Mark had asked for the money under the claim of saving his business. The texts and emails clearly said that. The judge pointed out that using the money to buy a house with someone else had nothing to do with saving a company. During another hearing, Mark finally spoke. He said he felt overwhelmed and lost and didn't know how to balance everything in his life. He implied that he needed the beach house as a way to start over mentally. Listening to him say that made me feel tired. He wasn't taking responsibility. He was trying to shift the blame onto stress and confusion. I understood stress. I knew life could be hard. But I also knew the difference between needing help and using someone's trust to fund a private escape. After weeks of hearings and reviews, the judge delivered the decision. He ruled in my favor. He said the evidence showed that Mark had obtained the money through false claims, and that I had every reason to believe my retirement savings were being used to keep the business from collapsing. He said the purchase of the beach house for personal use, especially one connected to an affair, had no connection to the purpose Mark had stated. The judgment required Mark to repay the entire amount. Mark looked shocked when he heard the decision. His attorney lowered his head. I stayed silent. I didn't feel proud or victorious. I felt sad. I felt the weight of a family breaking apart, but I also felt a small measure of relief. Not happiness, just relief that the truth had been recognized. The attorney explained that since Mark didn't have the money to repay me, the judgment allowed for a lien against the beach house. If Mark couldn't refinance the property to cover the debt, it would have to be sold. I knew he wouldn't be able to refinance. His business was too unstable, and he had too many expenses. The lien went into place and the process to sell the house began. The sale took time. I didn't watch the listings or track the updates. My attorney handled the details. One afternoon he called and told me the house had sold. A large portion of the proceeds went directly toward the repayment. I recovered a significant part of the money. Not all of it, but enough to ease some of the fears I carried about my future. When he told me the amount, I didn't feel excitement. I felt tired. I felt older. I felt like the cost of retrieving that money had been heavier than the value of the dollars themselves. Mark didn't contact me after the sale. Instead, I heard from his wife again. She told me she was moving out and staying with a relative. She said the affair had been going on longer than she realized, and now everything felt broken. I felt bad for her. She didn't deserve any of this. She sounded lost, and I knew she was trying to rebuild her life the same way I was trying to rebuild mine. Months passed. My relationship with Mark became almost non-existent. He sent short messages sometimes, usually about paperwork or practical matters. There was no warmth in them. I didn't try to force conversations. I didn't try to fix things. I accepted that he needed time and maybe distance. I also needed time to understand what had happened and how to move forward from it. I focused on simple routines again, morning walks, reading, cooking small meals, trying to rebuild a sense of stability. The money I recovered helped, but it didn't erase the emotional damage. I carried that with me every day. Sometimes I felt sadness. Sometimes I felt anger. But most days I just felt quiet, like I was trying to learn how to live with the truth. In the end, the justice I received wasn't loud or dramatic. It was slow, steady, and necessary. It didn't fix my relationship with my son, but it protected my future. It reminded me that even when the betrayal comes from the person you love most, you still have the right to stand up for yourself. Thank you for listening to my story on elder vengeance. If you liked the story, give a like and subscribe to the channel.